Hello, everyone, and welcome back to our lecture series on engineering the various subsystems of your body. We're continuing our discussion with another system, which is the excretory system. And as with the other sections, where we've started from the bone and teeth, and then we've moved on to the cardiovascular system, and now the excretory system, we will follow the same pattern of talking about the anatomy, talking about the health and disease states of these organs involved in these systems, and then we will introduce the most recent medical advances made, and we'll talk about material aspects of these medical devices, implants, and innovations. So following that same path, today we're going to start this last section, which is the excretory system, and this section will last for 2 weeks. So we will start again with the physiological function and anatomy of the excretory system. We will discuss various organs involved in the excretory system in relatively average detail, not too much, but just to give you a general idea of the physiology and function and the various components involved in these systems and the cellular structure and so on. And then we'll move on to talk about the diseases involved in the excretory system. And then we will look at the mechanics of the excretory system in a bit of detail. So to start today, we're going to kick off this section talking about the function and anatomy of the excretory system. So common understanding, and if you search of the excretory system, is that these components are the main parts of this system, and this is the full loop. So you've got the kidneys, you've got the bladder, and then some also include the intestines, of course. But the reality is that this is a very narrow image of the excretory system. Although the name suggests excretion, and that makes you think of the intestines and the basically the kidney and bladder system, but it's not limited to these. So the truth is that there are various other organs involved in excretion, including our skin, which is the first site where you have sweat and other solutions that gradually diffuse and in some cases leave through the pores of the skin. You've got the lungs, where you've got the exchange site of the air that we breathe in, and the CO2 that we have secreted by our biological basically subsystems. And then you've got the liver, which also has a very similar anatomy to the lung and kidneys, in that it actually is exchanging these substances between the cells and the external fluids, which will be circulated. So this is actually a broader image we're looking at, and hopefully during this chapter we will get to look at the skin and the lungs, as well as the liver and kidneys in a bit of detail, not as much into the intestines and bladder. But to start, we're going to actually talk a little bit about the physiology and function of the excretory system. So, as the name suggests, it's the subset of organs that are involved in removing cellular waste. And this cellular waste could be various things. It could be toxins, it could be CO2, it could be small molecules. So there's variety of things that could be circulated in the bloodstream as they leave the cells in organs across our body, and then get to these excretory organs to then exchange them with the external fluid. So basically, these organs are involved in the process of collecting and removing these substances, these harmful substances, and usually it's done via the blood circulation. Okay, and unless you have these systems, these poisonous wastes would just build up and gradually cause disease and illnesses, and that's really common. This has been and is a common outcome of having a deficient liver, a deficient kidney, or a partially functional lung, is that you actually start getting that lack of the ability to get rid of those toxins, and they gradually affect and influence the native tissue in various organs. So you can see that the signature, sort of the common aspect of all of these systems, is that you have layers of cells that line these tissues, and they've got compartmentalized structures where you've got a fluid such as the blood circulating, and then something like this air sac that you see in the right bottom for the lungs, that actually allows the external fluid to come in and out and then exchanges all those unwanted material with it. Or similarly for the structures that you have in your liver or the skin, you always have circulation in the proximity of this site or this interface of exchange. So that's basically the physiological function of these organs. And the organs that are involved, as I mentioned, the main ones that we're going to talk about are the lungs, which are our respiratory system, and they are mainly involved in excreting the unwanted gases, carbon dioxide, and some water vapor. You've got the skin, which is another important organ, and usually the exchange there is through the sweat glands. You've got the liver, which also is connected to the intestines. We won't be talking a lot about the intestines, but those also have very intricate structure to them, and they excrete the bile pigments that come from the destruction of hemoglobin. And they also are in charge of converting the nitrogenous waste, which is produced from the breakup or breakdown of the proteins into the urea. And then we've got the kidneys, which again, we'll talk about each of these in more detail, but they're also a very important organ involved in the urinary system, and they also play a very important role in basically processing the waste and then excreting it through the bladder. Now, if we look into a bit more detail, into the question of what the function of the excretory system is, we can actually divide it into sub-functions. So we've got the first function here is filtration, which is basically, as the name suggests, filtering, getting rid of some substances and keeping the bulk of the fluid. So you usually have an epithelium, which is permeable, which is a cell lining, a layer of cells, and it's permeable, but it's selectively permeable, meaning that it gets rid of some agents and molecules and the others remain. So that's basically what a filter is. So usually in these sites, you have these or let's say selectively permeable epithelial layers, and they are in charge of filtering the fluid. So what you need also in filtration is a pressure to actually allow that exchange in the permeable sort of membrane site. Just like when you have a liquid in a syringe and you're pushing it through a filter, you actually need some amount of pressure to allow the fluid flow to happen through the membrane. So this pressure is usually coming from the blood pressure. That's why at these organs you still want to have a considerable amount of blood pressure, even though they're on the low pressure end of the circulation circuitry, as we talked about before, but they still want to have some level of blood pressure so that it can handle the filtration function. Apart from filtration, these organs have another function, which is reabsorption. So they can selectively reabsorb molecules that, may be filtered already, but they can actually recover it back. This is when the fluids are staying there in stagnation for a while, or when you basically have dynamic diffusion happening. So although that blood is filtered once, it may actually still reabsorb some of those molecules, which is a function we don't usually think of as one of the primary functions. And they've got secretion, which is basically, as the name suggests, secreting proteins and molecules, and basically signaling the transport pathways to then extract those toxins and the ions. And then you've got excretion, of course, which is then to basically allow these wasteful secretions to exit the body in the form of urine. So basically, you've got sort of this granular level of functions, which include filtering the useful stuff and the unuseful, reabsorbing some of it as the fluid sits, and then secreting and excreting the molecules as in the form of a fluid. So there are also secondary functions that are less important, or let's say not the main functions, or what you would actually see causing failure of the other organs, but are still as important. I mean, maybe not as important, but they're still important. So for example, if you're talking about the skin, these are some of those secondary functions. So waterproofing, for example, okay, if you're swimming for a long period, although you can see that the skin texture and the structure of it can change a bit, but it doesn't actually influence the body. Although you may actually be there for quite long, it does influence it in a negative way, and that's a lot of it is because of the structure of the skin. It's specially designed to be waterproof, meaning that it's able to still exchange, but in a rather one-way fashion, and not allow bulk flow of water into the body. Regulating body temperature is another important factor. So the layers of skin, as we will look at in a minute, act as an insulation. And so although you need to wear significant clothing, but don't basically overlook the importance of the skin layers in regulating your body temperature. There are some interesting ones, like for instance goosebumps. So this isn't really a function, but it's the the contraction of those muscles, which actually then creates insulation of warm air, which we sense as a goosebump, but it's basically a multicellular cascade that happens in sensing basically a signal from the outside through the nerves. You've got sensory detection, again, through those nerves. You can detect heat, temperature, basically. You can detect force and pressure, and of course pain, which is also some sort of pressure and force. And then you've got protection from disease. So these are our first line of defense against microorganisms and dust. And then we've got protection from UV rays, which could be very harmful to cells inside our body, you've got those melanocytes that produce melanin, which actually absorbs and then therefore reduces the influences of UV rays. So there are a variety of functions. This is just for the skin, but for each of these excretory organs, there are a variety of functions additional to the main ones, which are common between the excretory system organs. The other ones, they have their own secondary functions as well, which are more detailed and specialized. So now that we've talked about functionality, let's talk about these organs one by one. So the first one is our skin, which is indeed an organ, and it has the largest surface area, I would say. It has actually a very interesting multi-layer tissue structure, and this multi-layer structure is anisotropic, meaning that it has different mechanical properties in different directions. So if you stretch skin laterally versus if you try and pull it apart orthogonal to these layers, you'll see different mechanical properties. So as I mentioned, this anisotropy also is present in terms of the active tensile stresses in the skin. So if you actually puncture skin with a needle, you'll see that the hole would actually elongate in one direction, meaning that you've got more tension in one direction than the other. And this varies. So if you look at your arm, for instance, the skin in your arms versus the skin in your individual fingers, each of those have a loop stress, which is different from the longitudinal stresses. And these various stress levels mean that you have higher stress in one direction and not the other. So this really helps surgeons, and they have to actually have a good understanding of that when they're trying to make incisions. Okay, so when making incisions, you want to select a direction that actually is in the direction of that shear, that maximum shear, so it doesn't tear apart and then make it even more difficult to put together. If you select it orthogonal, then you're going to have to pull it together with those sutures with more force. So there are non-uniform anisotropic loadings on the skin, and the stiffness and mechanical behavior is also different. So apart from that, the other thing which is quite interesting is that the mechanical properties vary as you introduce high levels of stress and strain. So as you can see, the stress-strain curve is non-linear, but in a very special way. It actually starts with a low slope, okay, and then it increases. So as you can see, it's becoming stiffer and stiffer as you exert more stress and as it is stretched further. So the reason for that is the alignment of your the collagen fibers, the protein fibers in your skin. As they get aligned, they become stronger and stiffer in the direction of alignment, or the direction of the tensile force, basically. So that means that the slope is going to increase, and you're going to experience a stiffer skin as you exert more force. So this is also an interesting behavior. But then a couple of interesting facts. So if you look at a square inch of skin, okay, relatively small area, we've got many square inches covering our body, but every square inch has about 65 hairs, 100 glands that actually take care of. So you've got two sorts of glands, vacuous glands and sweat glands, and each do their individual tasks. We're going to talk about sweat glands more extensively. And then you've got a significant amount of nerve bundles. So you've got 78 yards, about 78 meters of nerve, basically nerve networks. So if you put them together, the length of all those connections, it's a very intricate structure there. 78 meters is quite a lot. And they've got about 19 yards, 19 meters of blood vessels. So a yard and a meter are approximately similar. I think it's 0.9. But basically, 15 to 20 meters, that's a significant amount of blood vessels in a single inch squared. So those are some very, I would say, interesting and insightful numbers there. But then you've also got about 10 million cells involved and about 1,300 nerve endings or junctions. And they've got about 20,000 sensory nervous cells, which is also a big figure. And then in terms of the layered structures, you can see you've got the epidermis, you've got the dermis, and you've got the hypodermis, which is the lower layer. And each of these have their own functions. So the outer protective layer that doesn't have any blood vessels is the epidermis. Then you've got the dermis, which is the inner layer, and it has all those sensory networks and the nerves inside it. It has the oil glands, those are hosted there, and it's got the blood vessels as well. But then the hypodermis is really where the blood vessels start, and they start branching. They've got more glands, the speculous glands, and all other stuff. So it's really at the base of it. You've got the proteinous, so the proteins of each layer are going to be different. The composition for those fibers is going to be different. And so that's why you get different mechanical properties in each. When we're looking at skin in terms of its function and the structure in a little bit more detail, we're going to notice these glands, so these sweat glands, and they are basically sweat is that you're familiar with it. It's watery fluid which is composed of sodium chloride, salt, and lactic acid. Of course, it's got a very small amount of urea, and then you've got the amino acids and glucose. That's the composition of sweat, but then it's actually circulated via these glands, and then what they do is they actually secrete it through their tubular structure, and they've got this interesting sort of entanglement of their capillaries, which ends in an outlet, which sometimes is directly connected to the skin surface and the epidermis, and sometimes it's connected through one of these sort of openings for a hair. Okay, so as the hair follicle connects to the skin, there's a junction here that carries the sweat. And the proximity of these sort of entangled networks to the blood vessels allows these waste molecules to diffuse from the blood to the sweat glands. And so the temperature, as you have experienced, is the temperature of the body and the skin plays an important role in this sort of functionality of these glands. So as the temperature increases, you'll see that the glands are then, the fluid in the glands is going to start to expand and leave those pores. And so that's why it's a temperature sensitive process. And then they have this function of cooling the body by doing that, because the energy is then being used to basically pump these out. They also just passively expand out. And this is also an interesting point, that if the kidney fails, when it does, it actually then sort of directs the urea through the sweat glands. So you get a greater, a more significant portion of this sweat mixture is going to be the urea. So Now we will take a quick break and we'll continue the rest of the excretory system discussion, talking about our lungs. And so for now, we're going to take a quick break and then we'll continue this first section and move on to the mechanics of the excretory system and excretory system in disease. Thank you very much.